I kind of opened a can of worms with the last teaching because I was teaching on the biblical concept of submit or be subject to, not in the worldly view of submit. I thought that was going to be a one-part teaching, but this last week the Lord started dealing with me about some things that I think will help flesh out this biblical concept of submit, especially as it relates to husbands and wives. This teaching contains two unique insights into the relationship between husband and wife. We get those insights from understanding the cultural setting of the Hebrew marriage. I promise you today that you're going to learn some things you've never heard before, unless maybe you're Jewish, and things that are going to change your view of biblical marriage. After finishing the last teaching, I had this vague impression of failing. As I remembered what I had taught, I thought, man, I just didn't make it clear enough about describing this Bible concept of submit. And as you may know, I put all my teachings on YouTube and Rumble. Well, before I upload those videos, I go through them. I edit out the uhs and the coughs and the stutters, I not only want the videos to be as short as possible, but I also want them to be the best possible listening experience. I don't want there to be anything that's going to distract from whatever it is the Holy Spirit's trying to say through me. So each week, I spend hours literally editing that particular week's teaching video. I hope the listeners appreciate the effort. Anyhow, as I went through the video on submit, and listened to the teaching all the way through, I realized, I guess I had indeed described what that Greek word hupotasso means. That's usually what's translated into English as submit or subject to. And I realized, I probably did do a pretty good job of at least describing the New Testament version of submit. And let me summarize for you real quick what we found. Our English word for submit or subject to is really very limited. When we say submit, we're usually describing how a defeated foe might be forced to respond to their victor. Or we think of the relationship between a worldly slave master and their slave. It's really a fairly dark and depressing picture of human relationships when we say submit. The Greeks had a word like that, that was translated into submit in the New Testament at least once. And this Greek word was about submitting under duress. But the Greeks also had another word, hupotasso. And that's the word that's translated everywhere else in the New Testament as submit. Hupotasso is actually a military term that describes subordinates who arrange themselves under their leader in such a way as to work together with the commander to accomplish certain goals, like win a war, train, position a military unit, whatever it is. And as we saw how it was that this word described how a wife submits to her husband. She's not under his feet. She's a partner to accomplish the goals of the family. Well, Jesus and his followers spoke Aramaic or Hebrew, not Greek. Now, maybe Paul wrote his letters in Greek because he was writing to the Gentiles. But I got curious about how the Jews thought about wives submitting to their husbands. I wanted some authentic Hebrew pictures of that relationship, to make sure I was on the right track. So I thought, well, this is going to be easy. I'll just look up the word submit or subject to in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we see the English word submit only twice. The first time is in Genesis 16:9, where an angel tells Hagar that she has to submit to Sarai. And that Hebrew word is like we normally think of to submit. I mean, it means to abase yourself, degrade yourself, be afflicted. This is what we normally think of between master and slave. Degrading submission. This is a classical case of somebody being treated like a doormat. That's one of the submits in the Old Testament. The other one really doesn't even mean submit. It's a Hebrew word that means deceive. So it's probably a mistranslation. So, okay, that didn't help. What about maybe if we can't find submit, maybe I'll look up subject to. Yeah, that's it. Well, that's only used one time in the Old Testament, and it's translated as being a subject in a royal court. Okay, well, that's not going to help at all. There is a Hebrew word that's translated to English as over. It indicates someone who is over someone else. That implies authority, describes a hierarchy of leadership, but there wasn't any teaching associated with that and how that might work. I couldn't find any teaching on how a husband might be over the wife and how that might inform that relationship. Just didn't seem to be anything that was like the word that Paul used, the Greek word there in Ephesians 5. So at least for straight word studies, the Old Testament wasn't helpful. But this we do know, that Jesus, the Jew, he taught other Jews about how to live together. He got very specific about how we are to submit to one another. So that's a starting place. Matthew 20, 25 through 28. Matthew 20, 25 through 28. Jesus called them, his disciples, to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them." In other words, they're dominating in making people submit. "It is not this way with you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant." And then, just in case they didn't get the picture, "And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave, just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus, what he's doing here is he's contrasting worldly organizations versus the way of life in the kingdom. Worldly hierarchies and structures are all about one person being elevated above another. The leaders dominate their subordinates and they make them submit, in the sense of a slave submitting to his master, not in the sense of an equal partner who is working to help someone reach certain goals. The kind of human structure that Jesus described is ubiquitous. That means when he says that the first shall be last or servant of all, that applies to all Christian relationships, including marriage. Now, Jesus recognizes that humans work best together within a structure of some kind, a structure with different folks having different assignments. And some of those assignments require one person to lead or shepherd others. In worldly structures, the leader dominates those under them and expects the people under them to serve them. It's all about the underlings doing everything possible for the boss. Well, Jesus makes it clear that in his kingdom, the person with the boss assignment, that's actually the one who's serving those they lead and shepherd. Jesus paints a picture of how we're all in this together, and we're all working together to help each other and to serve each other. It's easy to apply this to family relationships, I think. As the husband, I take my responsibility as head of the house to mean that I am obligated to seek the Lord about the direction for the family. In my mind, the husband cannot complete that task without input and cooperation from his wife. So the husband serves the family by providing overall direction and goals. But based on what Jesus said, it seems clear that the wife should eagerly partner with her husband to serve him and help him be the best husband he can be. We're all gladly serving one another in a helpful way. Well, if that's the definition of submit, I think we can all find it a whole lot easier to submit to one another. Like Paul said, go to Ephesians 5:21 real quick, just a little review. Ephesians 5:21, Paul says, "And be subject to or submit to one another in the fear of Christ." So when Paul says that we're to do this in the fear of Jesus, I think he means that we are to see submitting to each other in this way as a sacred duty. Okay, all this New Testament stuff really helps with the picture, I think, of at least the theoretical husband-wife relationship. And we see it from a Jewish perspective in the Jew, Jesus. But you know what? I'm still looking for a Hebrew way to flesh out this a little bit more. Let me show you something I learned about men's skirts. Men's skirts? Men don't wear skirts. Well, not in Western culture, but you know what? In a lot of the Middle Eastern cultures, lots of men wear skirts. Maybe Americans might call them robes, not skirts. A skirt's defined as any kind of garment that hangs loosely, from the shoulders or waist. Did you know that the Old Testament talks about men's skirts? Go to Deuteronomy 22:30. Okay, get ready to learn something. Deuteronomy 22:30. A man shall not take his father's wife, so that he will not uncover his father's skirt. A man shall not uncover his father's skirt. What does that mean? Well, go to Leviticus 18:7. Let's see if that helps us. Leviticus 18:7. This law says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, that is, the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You are not to uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father. Other verses there in Leviticus 18 say you're not to uncover the nakedness of really any of your relatives. Well, as it turns out, uncover the nakedness of, or uncover the skirt of, is a Jewish idiom. It's an idiom for having sex with. I won't go into details about that, but maybe that's going to help you understand why Ham was so punished for uncovering the nakedness of Noah. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. Well, let's go back to Deuteronomy 22:30, okay? Deuteronomy 22, verse 30. A man shall not take his father's wife so as not to uncover his father's skirt. This first prohibition is not to take his father's wife. Well, that's pretty clearly about having sex with your mother or your stepmother. And here God makes that taboo really clear, I think. The second part of this verse, though, says exactly the same thing. It just uses this idiomatic form. The idiom uncover the skirt has two parts to it. Uncover is associated with uncover the nakedness talked about before. It doesn't mean to see a person naked. It means to have sex with that person. The skirt part of the idiom is really a beautiful Jewish way of looking at the one flesh relationship between a man and a woman. Now listen to this. In those days, men wore skirts, but a man could refer to his skirt and mean his wife. She was his skirt for at least two reasons. To a Hebrew of the day, she was a covering for him. Man, how many times has my wife covered for, protected me? But number two, she could be referred to as a skirt because she is so close to her husband. She's like her husband's favorite garment. Turn to Ruth 3, verse 9. Ruth 3, verse 9. If you have a King James, you'll get a better read on this the first time. He, Boaz, said to Ruth, who are you? And she answered, I'm Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. If you got King James, it doesn't say covering, it says skirt. Spread your skirt over me. This is the exact same Hebrew word that is translated as skirt in Deuteronomy 22:30. Don't uncover your father's skirt. Exodus 25:20. Let's see what that says. Exodus 25 and verse 20 says, the cherubim shall have their wings spread upward. This is talking about the lid to the ark, covering the lid with their wings and facing one another. The faces of the cherubim are to be turned toward the lid. This is with their wings up. You know that word wings there? That's actually the same Hebrew word that in other places is translated as covering or skirt. And this is actually the origin of the word for the man's garment, his skirt. It's like wings of a giant bird that envelop him and protect him. When a Jewish man referred to his wife as his skirt, he was saying that her nurturing arms wrapped around him, and they have enfolded him like the wings of a mother bird protecting her young. Isn't that a beautiful picture of how a Hebrew husband sees his wife? How in the world could you ever think that a culture where the man views his wife as a cherished covering, how would you think that could ever be acceptable for a man to treat his wife like a doormat? You know, there are cultures around the world that are very macho. The men lord it over the women. I mean, women are just second-class citizens in those societies. Paul said that a wife should be subject to her own husband. In these macho cultures, they teach their boys and men that women are generally to be subject to all men. And this is just not scriptural at all. It's certainly not the way Jewish men thought about their wives or other women. By the way, Jewish words for husband and wife are really pretty simple. The Hebrew word ish simply means man. But in the right context, it's understood by the listeners to be a man who's married to a woman, that is, her husband. The Hebrew word for woman is isha, and like ish, it simply means woman. But in the right context, it can refer to a woman who's married to a man, that is, his wife. Hebrew doesn't have separate words for husband and man, or wife and woman, so technically I could refer to my wife as woman. But you know, in English, that just loses something in the translation, right? In some cultures, it's offensive to call a female relative woman. So a Jewish man thinks of his woman as his skirt, his covering, his wings. The skirt was the garment that men wore all the time. It was his cherished, comfortable, familiar piece of clothing, just like his wife, his woman, was cherished and comfortable and familiar. The macho man paradigm, I mean, it would just never work in a Jewish home. But this picture of a wife being the man's skirt, man, that fits so well with what we learned in the New Testament, doesn't it? The New Testament word that tells the wives to submit to their husband is not about how a slave submits to a worldly master, but how a partner who is arranging herself under the leadership of her husband, her man, in such a way as to help accomplish the goals of the family to the benefit of all in the family. And if you like military analogies, well, you can think of the wife as the colonel to the general. Or you could say that the wife is to the husband, the head of the family, as each Christian is to Jesus, the head of the church. It's the same kind of submitting that you would see in the church, where the pastor sets the vision and leadership, and all parishioners arrange themselves in order so that they can serve the other members of the church and help reach the vision of that church. That's the biblical picture that you have, where we're all equals, but we all submit to each other. I want to explore one more idea of the wife being a partner to the husband, okay? She's a partner in a way that always enhances the family, and I want us to look at the Proverbs 31 woman, okay? So turn to Proverbs 31. She's described in verses 10 through 31. We're not going to read all that today, but that's the description of the ideal Hebrew woman, wife, mother. I do want to pick out a few verses so that I can illustrate the concept of a wife being her husband's skirt, his covering, his wings, submitting herself in a way that she arranges herself in her household in order to enhance her husband and to serve the whole family. You know, every sermon I've ever heard on this chapter is all about the virtues of the woman. And her virtues are many. She's amazing. But I want to look at this description in such a way that we can glean out an understanding of the relationship that this woman has with her man, her husband. So let's start in Proverbs 31:10, where it says, "An excellent wife or woman who can find? For her worth is far above jewels." Remember, there's no separate word for wife and woman. So who can find an excellent woman? That means this kind of woman is rare. She is worth her weight in golds and fine jewels, we might say today. Just like a good man is hard to find, right, ladies? Proverbs 31:11. "The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain." This says two important things about the marriage relationship. Her man's heart trusts in her. He doesn't trust her cautiously or begrudgingly. He trusts her completely, way down in his heart. She's not just earned a place of trust like a master might trust a slave. I mean, she's earned a place of trust like a close partner. If I say that I trust someone down in my heart, what do you think about my relationship with that person? You might say, wow, they must really be close friends. Or, man, they're really close, good buddies. I would never trust a servant or a doormat down in my heart, right? The other thing here is that he knows that she's going to bring good things to the relationship. He doesn't have to whip her or cajole her or force her to do good for him and the family. She arranges herself in order under his leadership in a way that the whole family profits from. A macho man never trusts in his wife because she's lesser than him. A macho man doesn't see the good his wife brings to the family. He just hopes she doesn't do him any harm or make him look bad. Do you see the difference? This passage isn't describing a macho man marriage relationship, and it's not describing a typical Middle Eastern marriage where the woman is little more than property. This passage gives us insight into the Jewish marriage, and it's describing a relationship of equals where one has decided to voluntarily submit to the leadership of the other. Let's keep going in verse 12. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. This woman never tries to undermine her husband. She's always there for him to help him be the head of the house. That's what God's called him to be. Genesis lays out the ideal family structure in God's mind anyway. First of all, marriage is a relationship of equals. Let's look at that. Genesis 2:23. Genesis 2:23 and 24. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife. They shall become one flesh." Listen, one flesh can only describe a relationship of equals. Go to Genesis 3:16. Genesis 3:16. To the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Here God establishes the structure of the family by giving the man the job assignment to rule or to shepherd. He always gives the man the responsibility to properly care for the family. The one who rules has been anointed by God to set the vision for the family. They've been anointed to be the final arbiter in disputes in the family. And the head has been anointed to represent the family to society and to God. Those of you who work in a company or an organization, you probably have a boss, and there may even be people under you that you supervise. Because your boss supervises you and your work, does that make that boss any better than you? No. There is a voluntary arrangement that's been made whereby you agree to let this person be boss and set goals and direction and assignments for you. And if you have a healthy relationship with your boss, they also want your feedback. They want your advice so that they can better fulfill their job. As a job assignment is just that. It's a division of labor. It's not a statement of value or worth, although some want to make it that way. I've had bosses, you've probably had bosses like this. They thought that their position in management made them better than me. I've worked with people on the other side of this coin who've been afraid to say anything to their bosses because they felt that they were somehow inferior to this person of high rank. That's Pharisee stuff. That's not life in the kingdom of God. Let's go back to Proverbs 31. Let's look at verse 13. Proverbs 31 and 13. She looks for wool and flax. She works with her hands in delight. She works with her hands with delight. The Hebrew word for delight is the same word translated as good pleasure, where the Bible says that God's delight or good pleasure is in us. The point is, that she's not working for her family under duress or degradation. She's getting up early and she's working hard because she wants to, not begrudgingly. This describes a voluntary partnership of equals. This describes a one-flesh relationship. This describes a Hebrew marriage relationship. Go to verse 15. She rises also while it is still night, and she gives food to her household and portions to her maidens. She rises early to do meal planning, is what this really says. In my translation, it says she gives portions to her maidens. That would probably be better translated for us today as she gives prescribed tasks, or she gives schedules to her house girls. She's the manager of the household. Husbands, listen. Let your wife manage the house, okay? When you start micromanaging the inner workings of the house, you become the macho man who acts like a tyrant more than a partner. Back to military terms, the general develops a strategy, gives broad orders, but it's up to his colonels under him to develop the plans and assignments that are going to carry out those orders. The husband trusts his skirt, his woman, with a deep trust. He trusts her to manage the inner workings of the family, leaving him time to, in this case, sit in the city gates and be important. You know, I could say that the husband sets the budget for the family and that the wife just makes the budget work, right? But if your marriage is a partnership of equals, then husband, man, you can't just make up a family budget on your own. I think the word consensus fits really well here. You two have to come into consensus on the budget. That doesn't mean that you're both totally happy with every aspect of the budget. It means that you're generally agreed to all the details, knowing that there are going to be some compromises, some give and take in setting out the final version of the budget. But where there are areas of disagreement, where everybody has to have a say in how things are supposed to go, but the husband has to play the role of final arbiter, knowing that he must do so just like Jesus, the head of the church, might do. Meaning that to the best of his abilities, his final decision has to be for the overall best for that family as a whole, not just for him. Proverbs 31:16, she considers a field and buys it. For her earnings she plants a vineyard. Ha! She runs a business. And it appears she's doing so without interference from her husband. You know, in the macho man societies, it's critical that the man be the primary provider for the family. That way the man can use money to manipulate his wife into doing whatever he thinks she ought to do or whatever she ought to be. You know, if I'm in a relationship with somebody that I have to manipulate, that's not voluntary. That's not a partnership of equals. If I have to hold leverage over somebody to get them to do what I want them to do, then they aren't really volunteering. And that's not really equals. I see them as a lesser object of some kind that has to be manipulated to serve me. I'm certainly not thinking about serving them if I'm manipulating, okay? Husbands, does your wife make more money than you do? Just praise God and enjoy the grace that comes with the job and the money. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that the man has to be the primary provider. You know why? Because God's supposed to occupy that role of primary provider for you and yours. A macho man, that mentality just doesn't fit anywhere in the relationship of Proverbs 31 woman and her man. Well, if you're not sure that a Jewish marriage is a joining of equals, then just keep reading Proverbs 31. The woman may actually be a better administrator and a better negotiator than her husband. She may work harder than he does. She may have better skills with people than her husband does. She may be more forgiving. She may be more humble than her husband. She may excel in lots of areas beyond her husband. But all of her efforts, all of her dedication is highly focused on making a better family under the leadership of her husband. And sometimes that means she even has to help her husband, her man, be a better husband. Wives, I contend that this is exactly what Paul meant when he said that wives should submit to their husbands just like he said that we all should submit to one another. And we'll call an end to this teaching at that.